Okay, so listeners, you know how much we love data here, and this report that you sent over the state of educational opportunity in America, this thing is massive. 50 states, over 20,000 parents. It's like taking a massive temperature check on education today.
Yeah, it really is remarkable, the sheer scope of this thing. We're not just talking about a single school district or even a single state. This report gives us a panoramic view of what's happening, I think, in classrooms and homes across the entire country.
Exactly. And I have to admit, when I first saw this report, I was kind of blown away by how big it was. I mean, 20,000 parents, that's a huge sample size.
Mm-hmm.
So let's ditch the headlines and really dive into the nitty gritty here. What was the most surprising thing that you found about how parents view their kids' education?
Going in, I think we both kind of expected a certain level of maybe pessimism.
Yeah.
Because, the news is always flooded with stories about failing schools and frustrated parents, right?
Right.
But actually, one of the most striking findings in this report was the level of satisfaction that we saw among parents.
Really? That's so interesting because, it does seem like we're constantly being hit with these negative headlines about education. So are you saying that overall parents are happy with their local schools?
Overall, yes. I would say more satisfied than you might expect. Now, of course, it's not like a completely rosy picture everywhere. The report's very clear that satisfaction levels can be like a patchwork quilt, I guess you could say, varying from state to state, income level to income level.
Uh-huh.
Even political views play a role, which I found fascinating.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. You're saying that where you live and what you believe can actually impact how satisfied you are with your kid's school.
Precisely, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about this report. It doesn't shy away from these nuances.
Yeah.
For example, South Dakota really stood out to me. Consistently across all income brackets, parents in South Dakota reported lower levels of satisfaction with their schools.
Interesting. Honestly, when I read the part about South Dakota, I couldn't help but think wow, parents there have some strong opinions. But it makes you wonder, what is it about the education system there that's causing this dissatisfaction? Is it funding? Is it the curriculum?
Yeah.
Or something else entirely?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, this report doesn't really give us all the answers.
You're right.
But what it does do is highlight those disparities and really prompt us to ask those tough questions.
That's a really good point, because it's not just about identifying the problems. It's about, like you said, understanding the why behind them, so we can actually start trying to find some solutions.
Exactly.
And that brings me to another big takeaway from this report, and that is access to extra help. Things like tutoring, summer programs. What did parents have to say about that?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. The report points to something they call an unmet demand paradox.
Okay, an unmet demand paradox. Now you've got my attention.
Yeah.
Break that down for us.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, while actual participation rates in things like tutoring programs and summer programs are lower than you might expect, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this huge underlying desire for these services among parents. It's there's this line of parents who really want to sign their kids up for these programs, but they're facing all these roadblocks along the way.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, just anecdotally, even talking to friends and family, I know that parents today are stretched so thin.
Right.
Juggling work and life and everything in between. So who's most affected by this unmet demand?
So the report highlights low-income families and parents of students who are struggling. They see the value in these programs, but they might not have the resources or the support to actually access them. And it's kind of heartbreaking to think about these parents who want the best for their kids.
Right.
For they see these potential opportunities, but it's like they're constantly hitting a wall.
Totally. And it really underscores how much education relies on what happens outside of the classroom, too. Which actually reminds me, that's a big part of this report's focus, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we often get so caught up in test scores and academics, and we forget about the bigger picture, right? This report goes way beyond that traditional view of education and examines the role of things like sports arts, faith-based programs, all of these things that contribute to the well-being of a child.
So what are parents saying about those activities? What do they want most for their kids?
Well, you might be surprised to hear that organized sports consistently topped the list when parents were asked about their priorities.
Yeah.
Even over things like arts or other enrichment activities.
Wow, you're right. That is surprising. It really challenges those stereotypical assumptions we have about what makes a well-rounded education.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a more holistic view of education.
Yeah.
But were there any other states that stood out to you in the report? I know you mentioned South Dakota earlier. Anything else catch your eye?
Yeah, Alaska and Wyoming were really interesting. They had notably low levels of parental satisfaction when it came to the availability of after-school programs. Which, again, just underscores that even within a single country, the education landscape can be so vastly different depending on where you live.
It's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And speaking of solutions, I'm curious, what does all of this mean for us? We've uncovered all these fascinating insights, but what are the takeaways? What can we do with this information? Because, here at the Deep Dive, we're all about actionable advice.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, data is only as good as what we do with it.
Yeah.
And I think in this case, this report is like a big call to action for all of us.
Okay. I love that. So what does that actually look like in practice? What can we as listeners do to actually make a difference here?
Well, I think it starts with awareness, like what we're doing right now, just taking the time to really understand the challenges, the gaps, those different priorities that exist within our own communities. And then it's about getting involved, right? Talking to your local school board, supporting those organizations that are already out there, providing tutoring or after-school programs, even just having open and honest conversations with other parents about what's working and what's not.
Yeah, I love that. So less complaining on social media and more actually taking action in our own communities.
Exactly. It's about going deeper than these surface level arguments.
Yeah.
And really digging into the nuances of what kids need to really thrive.
Yeah.
This report gives us the data. Now it's up to us to actually use it to spark change.
Couldn't agree more. It's been an eye-opening deep dive, to say the least. So before we go, what's that one final thought you want to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder, something to inspire.
Well, I think this report really highlights just how diverse the needs and priorities are within the American education system, right? And it really begs the question, in a world that's increasingly focused on this idea of personalized learning, how can we actually tailor our support systems to meet the needs of every single child? Regardless of their background, their zip code, or, whatever challenges they might be facing, that's the challenge and the opportunity in front of us.
Powerful stuff. A personalized approach to education now, that's something worth fighting for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of knowledge.